Who's biggest? From Brisbane, the latest from Podnews.net with Magellan AI. Apple or Spotify? Who's biggest then? Well, Spotify is biggest for total listeners to podcasts, but Apple is biggest for downloads, according to new data from Podtrac. The company also reveals that Spotify has the lowest number of episode requests per listener at just 3. Apple Podcast users download more than 9 times as many. Both Apple Podcasts and Spotify have achieved higher ratings from podcast creators in the second edition of the Podnews Report Card. I unveiled it last week at Podcast Movement Evolutions, and we've now published the results. You'll find them linked from our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Podcasting represents 12% of all time spent listening to ad-supported media, says Edison Research. Podcasting is beaten by AM/FM radio and YouTube for all ages, though. Podfest Global is to take place between March the 27th and 30th and claims it'll be the largest virtual podcasting event ever. The event is dedicated to monetization and audience growth, and tickets start at $49 normally, but if you use the code PODNEWS, then you'll get complimentary access. Nice. Jar Audio, a 50% women-owned company, is running a pilot competition for emerging women podcasters. The company will make and host a pilot episode, give mentoring and script support, and otherwise help your idea see the light of day. You've until May the 1st to apply, and yes, you keep your IP. Hernan Lopez, the former CEO of Wondery, has been convicted of wire fraud and money laundering conspiracies while working for 21st Century Fox. Awaiting sentence, Lopez faces up to 40 years in prison and millions of dollars in penalties. A lawyer for Lopez says they'll appeal. He left Fox in 2016 before founding Wondery, which was sold to Amazon at the end of 2020. There's no suggestion that Fox, Wondery or Amazon were involved. Podcast One signed an agreement with Seeker, an AI content scoring platform, to provide brand suitability for its advertising partners. Smart Passive Income is running a free 10-10-10 podcasting challenge. Starting on Wednesday, in 10 working days, they say you'll reduce your podcast editing to 10 minutes and book 10 guest appearances to expand your reach. Microphone manufacturer Shure is building the Shure MVX2U, a small attachment to turn any XLR microphone into a USB-C device. It's compatible with the company's Motive desktop application for compression and EQ. Hank from Free Podcast Tools has found the manual for the as-yet unlaunched product. BBC Podcasts Premium has launched on Apple Podcasts in Australia following its launch in the US and Canada last year. Scott Galloway pulled his show from Spotify in February 2022, writing a long article explaining the decision and how you can make similar difficult choices. We can't find a similarly long article explaining why he quietly returned to Spotify around February the 13th, and he didn't return our request for comment. Powered by ChatGPT, Podcast Mania lets you type in a few words to create a full podcast using AI. We've asked it for a full episode. You can hear the results in the latest episode of the Podnews Extra podcast, which you'll find in your podcast player. But here's a little clip.
It's not surprising that Android users have been clamoring for an Apple Podcasts app of their own.
Oh yes, and the New York Times asks, would you date a podcast bro? In People News, Adam Sachs, who joined SiriusXM through the acquisition of Team Coco, is taking on an expanded role as Senior Vice President of Entertainment, Comedy and Podcasts Programming for SiriusXM. It's a newly created role that brings together podcasts with entertainment and comedy programming for the first time. It's a Monday, so time for some tech stuff, and according to the Podcasting 2.0 podcast, Pocket Casts, one of the most popular independent podcast apps, is to support transcripts and JSON chapters. Meanwhile, 9to5 Google reports that Pocket Casts is developing a Wear OS app for smartwatches. Should we drop support for VTT and even HTML files from the podcast transcript tag? You can have your say in GitHub today. We were supporting a podcast transcript type of plain text in our RSS feed, which it turns out we entirely made up, and we've removed that from our feed today, and sorry for any confusion. Now, how about another tag? Podcast accepts guests. so that people know whether a show has or doesn't have guests. Good idea? Bad idea? Have your say in the Podcasting 2.0 GitHub. Links from our show notes and our newsletter today. Dave Jones is working on a fast podcast GUID resolver. And thank you to boosts from Mike Dell. Vegas Boost, good to see you, he says. Dave Jones, who says, yay, captivate at the news that the podcast host was adding more Podcasting 2.0 features. And Adam Curry, who says, value received and returned. Thank you, Adam. You can boost us too with your comments in Fountain or other new podcast apps.
To bring you the picture of Europe tonight, Columbia now presents a special broadcast.
CBS News Roundup is a new feed from CBS News, which might contain the oldest show in a podcast ever. The original 1938 broadcast of World News Roundup, which celebrates its 85th anniversary today. And In Proximity is new today from Proximity Media, providing listeners with a deep dive into the creative process of making movies, television, music, podcasts, and more, as well as a behind-the-scenes look at the making of the multimedia company's highly acclaimed projects and future titles. This podcast is sponsored by Magellan AI, who've just announced Measurement by Magellan AI. You can find out more at magellan.ai/measurement. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.